So I'm going to set the stage a little bit for where we are as an economy, because I think much of the focus has been on just how great the economy has been the last couple of years, right? We haven't had a recession. GDP in the third quarter was 2.8%. We have 4.1% unemployment right now. And so there's just this overall narrative that things are great, right? And yet for many Americans, it is not. So that gets into the two Americas hypothesis. So I like to set it up this way. If you owned a home before the pandemic, right, you now have record housing prices. The stock market is near a record high. It's pulled back a little bit from where it was post-election, but still close to a record high. So you're sitting on some pretty large wealth gains if you owned either of those two things. Wage growth has been pretty solid, right? If you didn't lose your job during the pandemic, you've seen some pretty solid nominal wage growth. And you continue to go out and spend, right? And so you see a large pocket of the population that continues to go out. They go to restaurants, they're going on nice vacations, they're going to Europe, they're going to Japan. You see quite a bit of spending out there. And that's really what's helped propel GDP, right? So if you look at the GDP number for the third quarter, it was largely driven by increase in consumer spending. If you didn't own a home before the pandemic, right, you're somewhat priced out of the market now, right? You're seeing no one's really selling their house, especially if you locked in your mortgage at less than 3%. So inventories are pretty low. Housing values are still pretty elevated. Everything that goes into buying a house is more expensive. And so again, many young people particularly are feeling like they're somewhat priced out of the market. If you don't own stocks, right, if your income is less than 50, particularly if you lost your job at any point during the pandemic, you're feeling pretty squeezed, right? And that's really where you're seeing a lot of this conversation. Many Americans are struggling to make ends meet. They're finding that it's difficult to pay off just regular bills. They're going to the grocery store. They're complaining about how expensive groceries are. So you're seeing that split there. And I think when you look at it from that prism of the two Americas, you get a sense of, number one, the split you saw in the voters, right? That was really just outlined a second ago. But it also explains that split screen story of the economy, where you can have an economy that is not in a recession. It's not going in a recession in the next year, in my view. And yet you have a lot of Americans who think we are in a recession. Moving into 2025, right, I expect we're going to be growing 2.4% in 2025. So no recession in my forecast, right? So that's a good sign. The Fed is going to cut rates. The unemployment rate is likely to stay right about where it is. I think it's going to stay around in the low fours, which is, again, a great number. And I see inflation cooling off a bit as well. And wage growth continues to be pretty solid. So I've given you some positives there. So let me give you some downside risks. I continue to think the biggest downside risk is geopolitical. We somewhat have forgotten about Ukraine and Russia, but we were reminded again this week that that's still a very real issue. Obviously, we still have the Middle East and we have Taiwan and we have a lot of other issues out there. So we still also are seeing slowing growth abroad. We're looking at slowing growth, and it's much slower growth in Europe and China, for instance, than we would like to see, and that certainly affects our ability to grow here. Obviously, the year is going to be dominated by a conversation about taxes, right? We knew that going into this election. We knew, regardless of who won, that the tax cuts from 2017 were going to expire, and we were going to have a conversation about taxes this year. Where we go from here, obviously, is the next step of that. Obviously, President-elect Trump would like to see corporate rates go down to 15. They're currently 21. It's more likely to be either the status quo or something lower than that. The other big unknowns, obviously, are what's going to happen with tariffs as well as immigration. I think shaping all of this conversation, whether we want it to or not, is that we have a $36 trillion debt, and it's going up about $1 trillion every 100 days. Interest on the debt is approaching $1 trillion a year, so it makes it the second largest expense in the federal budget. In the back of many folks' minds is going to be, when you're looking at that 10-year budget window, what can and can't be done, right? There's a lot